Today, we're diving into a really interesting theory from a source that argues America's national character has gone through this profound but really gradual transformation. So let's get right into it.
This single, striking quote is the absolute foundation for the source's entire argument. It paints this picture of a nation that starts out, gentle, almost lamb-like, but eventually, well, it takes on a completely different, much fiercer character.
So, how on earth does a change like that happen? The material we're looking at suggests it's not some sudden, dramatic event. Instead, it's like a slow drift. Imagine a ship that's just one single degree off course. At first, you wouldn't even notice, right? But over a long, long journey, it ends up at a totally different destination. And that's the core metaphor we're going to unpack. All right, so our first section really lays out this central thesis, a prophetic transformation of America's identity, from that lamb into a dragon.
But, to really understand this journey, we have to know where it all started. We need to look at what the source presents as the nation's original character. Okay, so this slide sketches out a very specific identity. The argument here is that early America was deeply Protestant, not just in its churches, but in its whole culture. Churches were seen as the nation's moral compass, its conscience. And a huge piece of this was a very specific way of reading Bible prophecy, one that identified the papacy as the Antichrist power. And get this, that belief was seen as an absolutely crucial safeguard of American liberty.
So if that was the foundation, how did it start to crack? The source points to two big things: an internal softening of beliefs and a kind of external strategic pressure. And this slide really shows you what that internal softening looked like. On the left, you've got the original view, prophetic, distinct, vigilant. Then on the right, you see what came later, a much more ecumenical, accommodating perspective. The sharp edges of that old theology were, as the source puts it, worn smooth. What was once seen as an essential belief for liberty was now starting to be seen as, divisive or just plain uncharitable. Now, at the same time this internal softening was happening, the source says there was this external pressure from the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. They're described here as a powerful force for the Counter-Reformation, whose whole mission was to win back Protestant lands through education, intellectual debate, and political influence. And this is a key point in the source material. This perceived threat wasn't some big secret. It argues that people, including figures like Abraham Lincoln, were worried. But they weren't worried about a military invasion. No, the fear was something much more subtle: the slow, systematic undermining of the nation's foundational principles from the inside out. Next up, a new prophetic map. The idea here is that this whole backdrop, the internal softening, the external pressure, it all set the stage for some pivotal events that would completely alter the nation's course. This timeline lays out three of what this source calls critical tipping points. First, the incredible trauma and division of the Civil War. Second, the assassination of Lincoln, who is positioned as a leader who really understood these threats. And then, a few decades down the road, a major theological earthquake, the popularization of a brand new way of interpreting Bible prophecy. This new system was called dispensationalism, and wow, did it ever take off. Its central prophetic idea was something called futurism. And the source argues this one concept had massive practical effects. It didn't just reshape theology, it reshaped the cultural and even the political outlook for a huge part of American Protestantism. So here's why that mattered so much. By shifting the prophetic focus away from a historical institution, like the papacy, to a single bad guy way off in the distant future, futurism basically removed the prophetic reason for Protestants to be wary of papal influence in the here and now. The watchdog, you could say, was now staring at the horizon, totally distracted. And then the source makes this absolutely huge claim. It alleges that futurism, the very idea that neutralized that old Protestant critique of Rome, wasn't even a Protestant idea to begin with. It suggests it was actually developed centuries earlier by a Jesuit priest, a guy named Francisco Ribera, as a direct counterattack against the Reformation's arguments, a theological counterstrategy, if you will. So, this brings us to our final section, which looks at the destination. The material argues that this combination of theological, political, and social forces steered that ship of state somewhere entirely new. So let's just quickly recap the path here. It starts with that internal softening of theology. Then you add the alleged infiltration of institutions. You layer on the national trauma from a devastating war.
And finally, you cement it all with a new, future-focused prophetic view. The point is, this wasn't one single event. It was a slow, cumulative process.
And that brings us right back to our original metaphor. The ship, after drifting just 1 degree at a time for centuries, has now arrived at a destination its original crew would find completely unrecognizable. The ultimate conclusion from the source is that the nation simply... And this leaves us with one last provocative question to think about. If a nation really is defined by its story, what happens when it forgets the original plot? What story takes its place? It's definitely something to consider. Thanks for joining me for this one.